All right, fair enough? Okay. Loris, upstairs. What? That's a nice shirt. I want that shirt. Okay, we're ready to begin. And folks in the back, please come up here. I swear there's space over here. Come on. You can't block that door, though. All right, so welcome to tonight's Human Journey Colloquia and the Center for Catholic Studies lecture. We are in for a rare treat. For the young people in the audience, you go hear rock stars tonight. You're hearing a rock star from the Catholic tradition. So it really is my honor to present Father James Martin this evening. He's a Jesuit priest who, before he became a Jesuit, worked for General Electric corporate headquarters, and we found out that he lived right here in Stamford and worked at GE right here. And then he read Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, and some of you in CIT 202 are reading a little bit of that, and that changed his life, and he decided to become a Jesuit. He's the author of several books, including The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, Jesus a Pilgrimage, and again, some of you in CIT 202 are reading Building a Bridge, How the Catholic Church and the LGBT community can enter relationships of respect and compassion. And he started the outreach ministry with the LGBT community and the Catholic Church. And he worked tirelessly to try and bring the Catholic Church and LGBTQ people together. And for that, he deserves lots of praise and gratitude. And for that, he gets lots of undeserved criticism and vitriol, and you may have seen some of the folks hanging out at Jefferson, but that's the fan club that follows him anyway. He has produced award-winning videos on the saints. He's appeared on various TV shows, including the Colbert Report. Tonight, we found out a little bit more about his friendship with Scorsese and how he worked on various films, including Silence. He was appointed by Pope Francis as a consultant to the Secretariat of Communications at the Vatican, and he was invited by the Pope to be part of the Great Synod on synodality. He's received several personal notes from Pope Francis, and tonight he took a picture of Bergoglio Hall, and he's going to send that photo to the Pope. He's received more honorary degrees than I could recite, and believe me, I could tell you so much about him, but then I would be talking and he wouldn't. But he received so many honorary degrees, we can't list them all, but I'll tell you the most important one that he received in 2010 from Sacred Heart University. And so he is now a member of the Sacred Heart University family. And as our friend, our family member, and our beloved friend, he comes tonight to speak to us right here at the onset of the Holy Weekend, Wednesday, Holy Thursday, Good Friday, to talk about his most recent book, Come Forth, which is about the meaning of the gospel story of the man Lazarus, who was Jesus's beloved friend. So join me in welcoming our beloved friend, Father Jim Martin.
My talk is somewhere. Where is my talk?
Oh, I did take it.
There we go.
I stole his talk.
There we go. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Great. Why don't we start with a prayer? Is that okay? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Loving God, we thank you for bringing us together on this beautiful day. We thank you for the gift of Sacred Heart University. We thank you for the gift of your Sacred Heart, which teaches us how to love. As we think about the ways you're at work in our lives, and we think about this story of Lazarus, give us a spirit of openness and trust. And we ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. I really am so glad to be back at Sacred Heart, not only because I'm an honorary graduate, which fills me with pride, but also because Sacred Heart has been very important to me personally. It was one of the first places to offer me a place to talk about my LGBTQ work, even in the face of protests, and I really appreciate that. And that was a long time ago, and so I'm really grateful to be back. I'm going to talk tonight about Lazarus. Now, raise your hands if you know the story of, don't be shy, raise your hands if you know the story of Lazarus. Raise your hands. Okay. Some of you, raise your hands if you don't know the story of Lazarus, and it's okay if you don't. Okay, so some of you don't. So very briefly, in the Gospel of John, one of the 4 Gospels, I'm going to take my watch off so I don't go over the 4-hour time limit that I've set myself. Don't worry. And thanks for packing in. I appreciate everybody coming in. Also, the other thing I was going to say is afterwards, I'm happy to meet you. I'm going to wear a mask because my mom is immunocompromised, and I see her every weekend, so I want to try to be careful after I chat. So in the Gospel of John, one of the 4 Gospels, halfway through in John chapter 11, 2 sisters send word to Jesus that their friend Lazarus, their brother Lazarus is ill. And they say, "He whom you love is ill," which is really powerful. No one else is described like that in the Gospels. Jesus waits a couple of days, and then he makes the few-day journey to a town called Bethany to meet the sisters. And by that point, Lazarus has died. The 2 sisters say to him, both of them individually, "If you had been here, our brother would not have died." A little bit of a statement of faith, but also a little bit of a scolding. He says, "Where have you laid him?" And they take him to the tomb. They say to him, "Come and see," which is what Jesus says to the disciples at the beginning of John's Gospel. He prays before the tomb and says, "Come forth," or "come out." That's the title of the book. And the dead man comes out. So it's traditionally called Jesus' greatest miracle, right? It's funny, the paperback version of this came out, and I was very proud and grateful that the Pope wrote a foreword to it. And he said in the foreword, the miracle that Jim Martin calls Jesus' greatest miracle. And I was like, well, I'm not the only one. But I don't want to correct Jorge Maria Bergoglio. So the main question to start with is a question my mother asked me, which is, Lazarus, a whole book on Lazarus? What are you going to talk about Lazarus for? And so the question, why Lazarus? Let's see if I can do this here. There we go. Okay. Now, some of you, raise your hands if you know The Chosen. Have you seen The Chosen? So quite a few people. When I was growing up, I'm 64. When I was growing up in the 1970s, there was a mini-series called Jesus of Nazareth that was produced by Franco Zeffirelli, the Italian producer. And it was kind of our generation's Chosen. And to show you how times have changed, it would air every year on network TV. And it was a 2 or 3 part series. And for me, the story of the raising of Lazarus was the undisputed high point. They didn't show Jesus' resurrection, as they often don't in films. But in the story of Lazarus, you have someone coming up on horseback and confronting Jesus, who's played by Robert Powell, the English actor. And they say, Lazarus, Mary and Martha's brother, is sick. And then the next scene is Martha coming up to Jesus and saying, "Lord, if you had been here, our brother would not have died." And he says, "Take me to the tomb." They take him to the tomb. I remember this very well. It's still on YouTube. People are nodding. There's a wide shot. There's a tiny, it's like on a cliffside. There's a tiny little opening. And Jesus, I got this picture, stands like this and says, "Lazarus, come forth." In a British accent, because we all know that he went to Oxford, right? Because he couldn't get into Sacred Heart. So in this great British accent, "Lazarus, come forth." And there's this wide shot, and the orchestra music swells, and it's really dramatic. And just this tiny little figure comes out, and everybody goes nuts and falls to their knees. It's very dramatic. And it got me thinking. I was 16 years old. I thought, who is this guy? Like, this is quite a miracle, right? Who are these sisters that come up to him and basically scold him? If you were here, he wouldn't have died. And what's the story? And what happens to the guy? And who is he? And how did Jesus know him? So it started me on a little bit of a kind of a quest to understand who this guy was. I mean, I didn't know much. I did not go to I was just listening to the stories of the CIT. CIT. I didn't have any of that. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I didn't study any Catholic stuff. I didn't go to a Catholic high school, so I didn't really know very much. So this was my introduction to the New Testament 101. So I just was really curious about who this guy was. And then a couple of years later, well, many years later, as you heard, I worked at, I consider myself someone who knows this area. I lived in Stamford, Connecticut. For 3 years, I worked at GE Stamford on High Ridge Road, GE Capital. I went up to corporate headquarters. Now I think it's great. It's now Sacred Heart University, West Campus, is that right? Fantastic. So I didn't know very much about the Gospels. I entered the Jesuits in 1988. And many years later, I ended up going to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. And the first night I was there, I said to the guy who was the head Jesuit in Jerusalem, I said, well, where should I go? And he goes, well, you should try the Sea of Galilee, of course, and the Garden of Gethsemane, and all these places, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And he says, and you should visit the tomb of Lazarus. And I was like, what? And I said, you can visit that? There it is. I had no idea. I said, you can visit. They know where that is? It was like, yeah, it's in Bethany, which is the name of the town that is in the Gospels. Today it's called, interestingly, I love this, and you can hear it, Al-Azariah. Can you hear that? It's Arabic for, still, the place of Lazarus. So the town of Bethany in Arabic, it's now in, very important topic to think about, it's in Palestinian territory. So that's why it has an Arabic name, Al-Azariah. And you go there, and that's the tomb that has been venerated since the earliest days of the church. They're almost 100% certain that this is it, okay? So I went there, and I was with two Jesuits, and there was no one there. It looked much like that. There was no one there. And that's, by the way, that's the Church of St. Lazarus in Bethany. So you get a sense of what it looks like. And I went down into the stairs. There aren't too many pictures like this that you don't see in like tour books. And I was all by myself in the tomb. And I thought, well, what am I going to pray about, right? I'm here in this tomb. I was all by myself. It was a small cavity. I think I have a picture of it. That's the tomb of Lazarus. So he would have been in that niche probably. And you can see the doorway. You have to kind of crouch to get in. There's a stairwell that gets you out. And I was all by myself, and I thought, well, what am I going to pray about? And I thought, well, what do I want to leave behind in this tomb? Do you know what I mean? Like, what do I want to let die? What can I leave behind? There's all things in our lives that we need to let die. And by the way, thank you for sitting up so high. I appreciate it. I hope you can hear okay. What do I want to let die? What are things that I need to let die that are keeping me stuck or bound or unfree that I want to let go of? Do you know what I mean? We all have things like that in our lives. Bless you. Like a grudge or a resentment or comparing ourselves to other people. I know that's a big thing for people who are college age, right? I want to be like someone else, right? Never sort of feeling comfortable who you are. Can you let that die? Can you hear God kind of calling you into new life? So I prayed about that, and I found it very moving. A couple of years later, I started to lead pilgrimages to this place, to the Holy Land. And we led pilgrims to this place, to Lazarus' tomb. And I thought, well, maybe I can invite them to do the same kinds of meditation, right? What do I want to let go of? And how can I hear God's voice inviting me to new life? And you never know if what appeals to you is going to appeal to somebody else. And people will come out of the tomb crying, right? Because it's a very powerful place to be. You're all by yourself. It's very dark. And we all have these things we want to let die. So I thought, well, I think it's time to write a book about it. So this is my COVID book, by the way. It took about 4 or 5 years to write it during COVID. So the first question, there's so much to talk about. The first question is, did Lazarus exist? Okay. So I have some great images of Lazarus. This was done for the book by an iconographer called Bill McNichols. That's an original painting, and it says, Ho Hagios Lazarus. So that's Lazarus of Bethany. We don't know what he looked like, of course. So did Lazarus exist? Some people say that Lazarus might have just been made up, right? That John's gospel just made him up, and just to kind of prove a point or to kind of tell a story. But New Testament scholars tell us that when we know a person's name in the Gospels or in the New Testament, outside of the disciples, right? We know Peter, right? James and John, Andrew. But we also know people like Mary Magdalene, right? Or Joseph of Arimathea, especially as we're coming towards the Passion. On the other hand, we have people who are like the woman at the well, or a man with leprosy, or a blind man, right? So most of the gospel stories where Jesus encounters someone, it's anonymous. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is New Testament scholars tell us that it means that the early church knew these people, right? So if you were telling a story, so there's 3 stages to the gospel. There's it happens, right? There's the story happening. There's the oral tradition. It was an oral culture, right? People tell stories orally. And then they're written down. The Gospels are written down. When it becomes clear that some people are dying, Jesus isn't going to come back soon, they write them down. In the oral tradition, if you're telling a story, like if I'm telling a story about Dr. Loris, can I say Michelle? Yeah. So if I'm telling a story and I say, well, you know, there's a woman up there at this university in Fairfield that has a forum named after her, you know, and they'll say, oh, no, that was so-and-so. Like if you're telling a story, people know who it is, they would say, that's Martha, that's Mary, that's Lazarus. So the fact that we have these names preserved, Joseph of Arimathea, right, Mary Magdalene, Lazarus, Martha, Mary, means that the early church knew these people, right? And so we can be almost 100% sure that Lazarus existed. Now, one of the questions that I had when I was growing up, this is from the cloisters. There's Jesus healing a blind man, and that's him raising Lazarus from the dead on the right. One of the things that bothered me was that Lazarus does not appear in the other Gospels. Did you ever think about that? If this is Jesus' so-called greatest miracle, why is it only in John, right? And New Testament scholars tell us that there's a pretty good answer for that, which is the story of Lazarus takes place in Judea, which is in the south. Galilee is in the north, right? The synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are concerned with Galilee, and John is concerned with Judea. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke already had stories of people being raised from the dead. So when we think of people being raised from the dead, we think of Lazarus. But there's 2 other incidents. Does anyone know them? Who knows the 2 other incidents? Anyone? The daughter of Jairus and the widow's son, the son of the widow of Nain. So one, the daughter has sort of just died. Jesus raises her from the dead. The other, the guy is dead and he's being carried out on the funeral procession, and Jesus raises him from the dead. So the gospel writers of Matthew, Mark, and Luke would have already had those stories. They didn't need another story, right? But interestingly, in Luke's gospel, so this is very Bible nerdy, I apologize. In Luke's gospel, there's a parable of a rich man and a poor man named Lazarus going to hell, or going to the afterlife, and Lazarus is treated well, right? The guy named Lazarus is treated well, and the rich man says to Abraham, go and tell Lazarus to come back from the dead and warn my brothers that I need to take care of the poor. It's a parable that Jesus tells about the need to care for the poor. And Abraham says, even if someone came back from the dead, they wouldn't believe him. Even if someone came back from the dead and said, take care of the poor, they wouldn't believe him. So in Luke, scholars point out that there you have a parable, right? The only parable in Luke's gospel where in all the parables where someone is named, right, Lazarus, about someone named Lazarus coming back from the dead. So people think that Luke's community would have known Lazarus. Now, that's a picture of what's called the beloved disciple. Raise your hands if you've heard of the beloved disciple in any of your classes. Okay, so not many, so I'll tell you who he is a little bit. In John's gospel, there's a mysterious figure called the beloved disciple. And he appears and seems to be the source of most of the stories from John, right? This comes from the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple, we're getting close to, Wednesday. On Good Friday, we'll hear the Passion, and we'll hear Jesus say to Mary about the beloved disciple from the cross, Mother, there is your son, and say to the beloved disciple, Son, there is your mother, right? So it's a very important part of John's gospel. The problem is we don't really know who he is. A lot of people think it's John himself, the writer of the gospel. Other people think it might be the Apostle Thomas. Other people think it might be like just us, like the every man, right, or every woman. And then some people think it might be Mary Magdalene. Probably unlikely because from the cross, Jesus says son, addresses the beloved disciple as son. Here is your mother. Recently, people think that it is probably Lazarus. Now, why would we think it's Lazarus? Well, first of all, Lazarus makes his appearance in John 11. The beloved disciple is only seen after that chapter, which is very interesting. It is as if the appearance of Lazarus is the introduction to the reader of the beloved disciple. There's also sort of internal proofs. At the end of John's gospel in John 21, remember the breakfast by the sea where the risen Christ appears to Peter and the beloved disciple? Afterwards, after they have that interchange where, remember, Peter denies knowing Jesus 3 times, and then Jesus forgives him 3 times, right? After that exchange, Peter says, well, what about him? Which is a great question. Like, you have the risen Christ appearing in front of you, and you're like, hey, what about him? It's called, I always say that's like getting distracted. And the gospel writer says, because of the, and Jesus says, well, if it is my will that he does not die until I return, what is that business of yours, basically? That's paraphrasing. And a lot of people say that story doesn't make sense about anyone other than Lazarus, because the next sentence is, because of that, the rumor arose that he would not die, right? So why would you say that about some Galilean fisherman? You would say that about Lazarus, who's been raised from the dead, right? So there's all these internal proofs about why he might be the beloved disciple. Now, there are other characters in this story that I want to talk about. The 2 most important, other than Lazarus and Jesus, are briefly Mary and Martha. Okay, so Mary and Martha are his sisters in Bethany. And there's a great story in Luke's gospel, this is a portrayal of it. It's an amazing story where Jesus is at their house in Bethany. Jesus used to hang out basically at Mary and Martha's house, probably to get away from the disciples and just relax, right? No, I mean, the disciples were kind of a contentious bunch. And so at one point, raise your hands if you know the story of Mary and Martha and Bethany. Let's just see. So probably about half of you. It's actually a funny story. Jesus is at their house in Bethany, and Martha says, Lord, don't you care that I'm doing all the work? Tell her to help me. Now, who talks to Jesus like that? I mean, that's pretty... And by the way, for those of you who are involved in church stuff, I wrote this, one of the great things about being able to write books like this is being able to send them to experts like New Testament scholars. And I sent it to a woman named Amy Jill Levine. And I said, when Jesus goes to their house for a meal, and Amy Jill wrote back and said, why are you saying there's a meal there? And I said, well, that's the gospel story. There's no meal there. And she said, yeah, she said, no, there's no meal there. And I said, yeah, I've seen the pictures. There's a meal there. They're having a meal. And she said, no. She said, what Martha says is, why am I doing all the diaconia? Why am I doing all the ministry, all the work, right? All the toil? And we've kind of conflated it, as Amy Jill said, to Martha peeling potatoes, right? One of the reasons we don't say, why am I doing all the work? And one of the reasons we have these traditional, that's Vermeer. One of the reasons we have these traditional portrayals, right, of Martha doing kitchen work is because of the word diaconia. And Amy Jill and other scholars suggest that for the early church, the idea that Martha would be associated, a woman be associated with diaconia, where we get the word deacon from, was a little threatening, right? So we think of it as that Martha making food, but it could have been any kind of work. In any event, Martha says, tell her to help me. But that's really bold, saying that to the Son of God. Tell her to help me. The only other time I know is when Peter and the disciples are in the boat and he says, don't you care, we're perishing. Like, it's another great thing to say to Jesus, don't you care? Now, one of the great things is that the portrayals of Martha and Mary are very similar to the portrayals of Martha and Mary in the story of Lazarus. So in the story of Martha and Mary in Luke's gospel, Martha's the active one, right? She's working. She's the one supposedly with the bread complaining. And Mary is at Jesus' feet. And you remember, when she complains, Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're worried about so many things. One thing is necessary, and Mary has chosen the better part, right? Now, unfortunately, that's usually used as a kind of insult against people who are active, right? I don't know how many people have heard this. Maybe it's a generational thing. But if you're busy, someone will say, Martha, Martha, you're so, and it's a little bit of an insult, right? He's not saying that you shouldn't be active, right? There needs to be a balance between being active and being contemplative. He's just saying there's a time and a place for everything, right? I mean, someone has to, do the work, basically. But interestingly, Martha's character in Luke's gospel is very similar to Martha's character in John's gospel. What does Martha do in John's gospel? There's pictures of Martha and Mary by my friend Bill McNichols. She runs out. She's active. She confronts him. Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died, right? Mary is more contemplative. She's back home. Martha goes back and says to her, the master is calling you. And when she reaches Jesus in Bethany, right, what does she do? She kneels at his feet. So it's very similar. So even in those two stories, you see how the early church retains these memories of these very strong women, which I think is very beautiful. Now, one of the lessons I like to think about with Martha and Mary is the value of honesty in prayer. All right, so how can Martha be so blunt with Jesus? So one quick story. So as you heard, I went to the synod. Pope Francis appointed me. It was a great honor to be at the synod for the last 2 years in Rome, which was very interesting. I can answer questions if you want after this. And someone said, a lot of people said to me, I swear, just like this, when you go to Rome, you need to tell the Pope this. And I was like, well, first of all, I don't talk like this to the Pope. But the question is, but Martha is talking like that to Jesus. How is Martha able to talk like that to Jesus? Well, we only talk like that to people that we know well, right? Like a good friend that you can kind of tease or scold or something. We only talk like that to people we are intimate with, right? That we're really like good friends. So it's a reminder, I think, of the need and the invitation to be honest with God, right? And that honesty sort of leads to greater intimacy, right, in your relationship. I think oftentimes, so I work as a spiritual director helping people with their prayer and their daily life, and oftentimes people say, I feel distant from God, right? I feel really distant from God. And sometimes when you ask them, it turns out they're not really being honest in prayer. I shouldn't ask for that. I shouldn't complain about that. I should just accept it. And it's very similar to what happens, by the way, thanks for dinner. What happens when you are with a friend and I'm sure even college-age students experience this, when something is happening in your friendship and you feel like you can't talk about it, right? There's something in between you and your friend. Someone said something, there was a little bit of a misunderstanding, and you don't talk about it, what happens? Your relationship gets kind of cold, doesn't it? Gets cold. I see people nodding. Gets very formal, right? And sometimes it stops. And it's very similar to our relationship with God. If you say only the things that you think that God wants to hear, or that you should say, or that are appropriate, right? Then your relationship with God gets kind of cold. And so I think what's interesting about the story of Martha and Mary is they remind us of the need to be honest in prayer with God, who wants us to be honest. Jesus has no trouble with Martha being honest with him, right? There's another scene in John's gospel where an apostle named Nathanael hears that Jesus is from Nazareth, and he says, can anything good come from Nazareth? So, we read that in Mass, and people are like, praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. But it's kind of a joke. I mean, this guy is making fun of Jesus' hometown. It's like, can anything good come from, fill in the blank of the town you don't like? I used to do this. I used to say, like, the name of the town that I was in, and people would get really upset. They'd be like, that's not funny. But Jesus' friend, Jesus' apostle, who would become an apostle, Nathanael, is making fun of Jesus' hometown. How does Jesus respond? Does he say, get away from me, you're terrible, stop making fun of my hometown? He said, now there's a guy I can trust. There is an Israelite without guile, and he becomes an apostle. So it's a sign of Jesus' desire for honesty, for intimacy with people. And Martha and Mary show us that. So Martha and Mary as honesty and prayer. This is another picture of Martha and Mary. That's actually from the Church of St. Lazarus. Now, one of the things, I'm flipping ahead, that's another great picture. I have a couple pictures here of Lazarus. One of the things I want to talk about is two things towards the end, and then I'm going to get to your questions. Towards the end of the gospel, Jesus says two things that I think are really important and very unusual. One is, take away the stone. So that's an image of the stone being taken away. and untie him and let him go. Take away the stone and untie him and let him go. Now, why does he say that? It's such a weird thing to say. Jesus could have, he's Jesus. He could do whatever he wants, right? The stone could have disappeared, or Lazarus could have just appeared. There's a scene in after Easter where the disciples are behind closed doors and Jesus just appears. So Lazarus could have just materialized. Why does he say, take away the cloth? So Lazarus comes out bound hand and foot, just like that, and with a face covering over his head. My sense is that Jesus is trying to get the crowd to participate, right? It's not just his miracle. And I think this has very important implications for all of us in terms of our friends. So the story of Lazarus, I think, can be an invitation for all of us to think about what we want to leave behind in the tomb, right? I've said that already. What do we want to let go of? What can we let go of and shed? But it's not just about us and God. It's also about other people. So one of the questions is, if you think about the stones, what kind of stones do your friends have that you can remove that keep them from being who they are, right? And living a free life and hearing God's voice. And how can you untie them and let them go, right? How can you help to free them? So I think Jesus is inviting us to participate in the freeing of our friends. I do a lot of work with the LGBT community, as I said before, and coming out for people is a real movement of freedom, right? And I think that's God's movement. God invites us to accept ourselves as who we are, whoever we are, right? LGBTQ, straight, whatever. But I think our friends can help us be more comfortable in that. We can help remove some of these stones and untie people, so we can help kind of participate in that. By the way, I'll tell you a funny story. That's another wonderful image of Lazarus by a guy named John August Swanson, more colorful. I will tell you a funny story. So what Jesus says to Lazarus is actually, in the Greek, I'm not a Greek scholar, but is duro exo. Duro exo. So Exodus, Exodus, it's a hodos is a road. Ex is out or away. So an exodus is a road out. So when the Jews and the Israelites were going out, they were going on a road out, right? Exo is out. Duro means come. So it's actually come out. But the reason I called it come forth was not only because I liked that first story when I was growing up, but because my publisher said, which is true, if you, after all this LGBT work, call your book Come Out, people aren't going to understand it. So it's come forth. But coming out is an important part of people's lives these days, right? But I decided not to call it come out. Now, what happens to Lazarus? Everyone wants to know what happens to Lazarus. He's raised from the dead, then what? Well, this is a scene from The Last Temptation of Christ by Martin Scorsese, 1989, I think. And he's killed, he's murdered. Most people think that because it says in the Gospels, that people started to plot against him, that he was actually murdered, right? And the reason he's murdered is because he is kind of a sign of Jesus' power, right? So that's most likely what happened to him. Interestingly, if we're coming towards the Triduum and the end of Holy Week, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the precipitating factor for the crucifixion is, who knows? Let's see who knows what the precipitating factor for the crucifixion is in the Synoptic Gospels. You can call it out. I won't look and see who it is. Very good, A+. The cleansing of the temple. So Jesus tosses the tables over, right? And that stirs things up, and then that leads to his death. In John's Gospel, it's the raising of Lazarus. And I was reading something recently that really helped me to understand this. If John's Gospel is accurate in that, right, it makes the procession on Palm Sunday much more understandable. So on Palm Sunday, you remember, which we just celebrated, perfect timing, right? Palm Sunday, Jesus has this tremendous reception, right? People are filling the streets and laying palms in front of him and saying Hosanna. That's something that you would say to someone who's just raised someone from the dead, right? That makes sense. Someone who turned over tables in the temple, okay, that's nice, but I don't know if we're going to have a big parade for you. But so my sense is that this leads to Palm Sunday, the raising of Lazarus. But people can't really abide the fact that Lazarus is alive. So it's most likely he is dead. Now, in other places, there are some interesting traditions. In the Eastern Church, Lazarus he moves to Cyprus. And he goes to Larnaca. This is in Larnaca. I've never been there, but I was told by someone how to pronounce it, not Larnaca. That is the Church of St. Lazarus. And he was supposed to have been the first bishop of Cyprus, died there, and then his remains went to Marseille. Hold on a second. I think I have. Oh, okay. This is a little getting ahead of myself. In the Western Church, one of the traditions is that Lazarus and Martha and Mary are put on a boat to punish them without oars, and they sort of miraculously go to where? Marseille. So in Marseille, the two legends kind of cohere, and there's a church in Marseille, or near Marseille, called the Church of St. Lazarus. Most likely he was killed. Now, I want to talk a little bit very briefly, about some really nice images. Lazarus is in film, art, poetry, plays. This is one of the earliest depictions of Lazarus. It's from a 3rd century catacomb in Rome. Notice that Jesus, that one of the earliest, because they're still dealing with kind of Roman and Greek notions of miracles, Jesus has, a la Harry Potter, what? What's he have? A wand. Now, as far as we know, Jesus didn't use a wand, but, they're kind of enculturating. That's poor Lazarus. This is from Giotto. Now, one of the great things, and I'm happy this is up there, look at the guy on the far right. There's Martha and Mary kneeling at his feet. Lord, if you had been here, there's Lazarus coming out. One of the things I love about these portrayals is that, does anyone know what Martha says when Jesus says, take away the stone? There will be a stench. Martha's very practical. It's Martha. It's amazing. In just these two stories, these are two stories. We have very little about Martha. We know exactly what kind of person Martha is. She's not helping me, and it's going to stink, right? In the book, in this Come Forth book, I say that Martha's really focused on the practical, which is good. Everybody needs to focus on the practical, but there's more to life than that. There's always someone in a picture of Lazarus holding his cloth to his nose. See the guy on the right? Because of the stench. It stinks. See, he's holding his hand up. Oh, my God, it stinks. Sorry, I just took the name of the Lord in vain. So sometimes they portray Lazarus in contemporary. I think this is really quite beautiful. It's a 19th century German artist. It's in a German courtyard, and there's Lazarus on the right coming out. Look how kind of pale he is. And there's Martha and Mary. Now, do many of you know the Henry Osawa Tanner picture of the Annunciation? Have you seen that? Some people are nodding. He's an African-American artist. Someone loves it. He's holding his heart. Mary appears on a kind of, look it up. It's really great. Henry Osawa Tanner. It's Mary. She's on a bed. It's kind of rumpled sheets, right? And the Holy Spirit is just a beam of light. It's stunning. Most people don't know he did a Lazarus, too, in some of the same colors. So there's Lazarus kind of being brought up from the dead. This I love. This is a Cameroonian artist who did a whole series of pictures of the life of Christ. And this is Lazarus. This is the raising of Lazarus from him. And then finally, this guy, you don't see too many pictures of Lazarus and Jesus embracing. This guy did it for my book. So that's a brief sort of summary of the book. And maybe just some questions, some reflection questions for you guys to think about, and then I'm happy to answer your questions. So the first question is, what are you called to leave behind in your tomb? What are you called to leave behind in your tomb? What things do you really feel are keeping you bound or unfree? Let me tell you, I have a lot, right? I have a lot that keeps me unfree and bound and not the person I want to be, right? And one of the things, you don't have to go to Bethany to do this or the Holy Land. You might just actually imagine yourself in the tomb. Imagine yourself in Lazarus's tomb and think about what you'd want to leave behind. And then imagine the second question, where is God calling you into new life? Now, look, we have so many different people from so many different ages, from college age to, I guess you call me middle age, to elderly. Middle age keeps changing for me, by the way, and so does elderly. I was talking to someone the other day, this young person in college, and they said, oh, and then I went to this party, and there are all these elderly people there. They were like 50. And I was like, oh, thanks a lot. So where is God calling you into new life? Where is God calling you into new life? What is God's invitation for you to live a new, healthier, freer, more loving, more charitable life? And what do you got to get rid of to do that? And then finally, how are you called to free others from their grave clothes? What stones can you take away from your friends' lives? So just 3 questions. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards or right now, and then sign the books and meet with you guys. So I didn't want to talk too long. I much prefer the questions. The end. So thanks. So we have Q&A. So maybe
I told you he's a rock star. Yes? Questions?
questions, comments about anything, about LGBT stuff, about Lazarus, about the.
Yeah, if you want to ask him about
Whatever.
any of his other work.
Be like Martha, be honest.
Coming. Hold on.
Only easy questions, though. Holy Thursday question. Holy Thursday is tomorrow. How's that?
Yeah.
Is that the?
Did Judas have free will?
Oh my gosh. It's just like, can I have another easier question, please?
Start with a hard one.
Yeah. What's that?
Start with a hard one.
That's all right. No, that's okay.
Oh.
Did Judas have free will?
Did Judas have free will?
All right. So today is. Who knows what the name of today is? Has anyone heard? I had not heard that before, like 10 years ago. Today is so. Tomorrow is Holy Thursday, then Good Friday, then Easter, whatever, Holy Saturday, and then Easter Sunday. Today is sometimes called Spy Wednesday, and I was like, what? When I first heard that, I was like, what? So it's about Judas kind of being secretive and going out. So this is the day that we read just today, the story of Judas, who goes out and, as we know, betrays Jesus. Now, why did he do it? A couple of years ago, like 20 years ago, I worked on a play in New York with a guy named Stephen Adly Girgis, and it was directed by Philip Seymour Hoffman. It starred, how many of you seen The White Lotus? Oh, very good. It starred Sam Rockwell as Judas, and it put Judas on trial for the death of Jesus. And one of the questions we had to grapple with was why Judas did it. Did you ever think about this? Now, in the Gospels that we read yesterday, it said Satan entered into him, which a New Testament professor of mine said explains either everything or nothing, right? I mean, that doesn't really tell us very much. So the theory is this. Why did Judas do it? Well, first theory is he did it for the money, 30 pieces of silver. Now, that is in addition to giving rise to a great deal of anti-Semitism, right? So Judas from Judea, right? That leads into all this anti-Semitism that we have to avoid. Doesn't make sense, because why would Judas be traipsing around with Jesus for 3 years, like sleeping by the side of the road if he wanted to get rich? Doesn't make too much sense. The second idea is that Judas did it just because he was a bad person, like he was just awful through and through all the time. That doesn't make sense because Jesus chose him, and Jesus, we can assume, is a fairly good judge of character, right? The third theory, which I think makes the most sense, is that Judas, and I think he did have free will. I mean, I think Jesus probably understood someone, because of human nature, was going to betray him. But my sense was that what Judas did is he wanted to force Jesus' hand. And he wants to force Jesus' hand by putting him into the hands of the Romans, right? And so he'll act. So when I was working on this play, I said to some of the actors, like, this is my kind of interpretation of it. And one of the actors said, which I thought was great, he wanted to throw him in the deep end. I thought was great. That's what you do. I mean, it's a terrible thing to do. You throw them in the deep end, you see if they can swim. And so to me, that explains why Judas did it. It also explains the suicide, because Judas, as you know, commits suicide. And I think if he were doing it just for the money, why would he care if Jesus were, killed or executed? And if he was just a bad person, why would he care? But the fact that he commits suicide seems to indicate that he hoped that something good would come out of it, right? So, but I do think he had free will. He made a bad choice, though. Yes, don't be shy. Maybe even up there, way up in heaven.
Any questions up there?
Yes, up in heaven.
Yes, you do. You have to stand up and shout it. I can't run up there.
The question that I have is, how can prayer help us release what no longer serves our purpose? And how can this
Wow, what a great question. How can prayer, what was the first part? Help us release release what does not, and how can prayer, oh, that's a great question. So how can it help release us? What a great question. I think that really by being honest in prayer, it's like any relationship. So one of the best analogies I heard about prayer was from a guy named Father Bill Barry. If anyone's from Boston, he used to be up in Boston. He said that prayer is like a personal relationship. So anything you can say about a good personal relationship, tell me your name again? Ty. I don't say it right again. I didn't ask you the first time, but Ty. So Ty, anything you could say about a good friendship, you could say about a good relationship with God. So what does a good friendship require? Okay, well, the first thing it requires is time, right? You would never say, like, I'm good friends with this person, or I don't spend any time with them, right? But often people say, oh, I'm close to God. Do you spend much time with God in prayer? No, not really. So you have to spend time. Listening. Now, you would listen to a friend, obviously. But what does it mean to listen to God in prayer? Obviously not like hearing voices, but, noticing where God is in your life, right? In prayer, what insights come up, memories, desires, those things, but also where God is in your daily life as students, right? Where is God present? How is God kind of, in a sense, communicating with you? So listening. But another thing that's really important for good friendships is what? Honesty, right? So we talked about that earlier. So if you're not honest with your friend, you all know this. If you're not honest with your friend, I'm sure you have people in your life that you feel like, oh, I can't say that to them. I'm mad about this, or they don't want to hear that, or they're tired of hearing that. The relationship gets kind of stale, right? So by unburdening yourself and by letting go of things, by being honest with God, it kind of moves you into a deeper relationship with God. So those two questions are very, very much related. The more honest you are with God, the more you can kind of unburden yourself and be who you are with God, the closer you'll feel to God. And it's like with a friend, right? So I think anytime you think about what's going to help my prayer, think about what would help it in a friendship. Does that make sense? All right, thank you. Good question. Yes.
Here's one here.
Okay.
Hold on.
So when Christ showed up in Bethany, theoretically he could have said, Martha and Mary, Lazarus is in a great place. He's with my Father. We're going to be with him,
Right.
In time.
Right.
And instead he rose him from the dead. And, I have to think that part of that was to celebrate the friendship that he has with him,
Yeah.
and him wanting more time with him on earth. Is there anything that we can deduce about friendship and kind of how Christ supported friendship and spending time with people like that?
That's a great
here?
question. Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a profound question on so many levels because, first of all, we know that Lazarus and Jesus were good friends. Because I think it's so beautiful. In the Greek, it's hon philes. So when you think about what Martha and Mary could have said in this message, or whether or not it's on horseback or not, what could they have said? They could have said, Lazarus, our brother, is ill. Right? That's normal. They could have said, Lazarus of Bethany is ill. That sounds like a New Testament way of saying a Lazarus of Bethany. They could have said, Lazarus, your disciple, is ill. They say, he whom you love. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, that's so powerful. In fact, there's a tradition that because Lazarus says no words in any of the Gospels, and the house of Martha that we saw where Jesus was, we saw pictures of, is described as Martha's house. Now that, if you think about that, well, that's interesting. Martha's house? Now, some people say women could have owned houses back then, but that's kind of unusual in a patriarchal society. Why wasn't it Lazarus's house? Some people think, and because of the location of the town and the name of the town, that Lazarus and the sisters might have been in some way disabled and even having leprosy, right? Because Bethany could mean house of affliction, and it's outside the temple precincts. And Lazarus, some people say, could have been developmentally disabled, which is why he doesn't speak. So this idea of Jesus loving this person who is disabled is really kind of powerful. So the first thing to say is that Jesus obviously loved Lazarus. Now, interestingly, when he finds out that Lazarus is sick, he waits 2 days, which is kind of mysterious, and I talk about in the book. And I think a lot of us have these experiences in our life, like why does it seem like God isn't doing anything, right? And that's why they're mad at him when he comes. Now, why does Jesus wait? Well, I mean, one answer would be, instead of healing him, which he could have done, right? He wants to give him something more, right? Something greater. Another is that he wants to basically show what the power of the Father is, right? He wants to, this is his greatest miracle. And in Jewish tradition at the time, the soul hovered over the body for 3 days. And so if he raised Lazarus from the dead before 3 or 4 days, people would have said, he wasn't dead really, you know. But really in John's gospel, what happens is Jesus, which is very mysterious, Jesus is always in control. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's a little more earthy. In John's gospel, it's almost as if he's resurrected. I'll go when I go, basically. I'm in charge. So a little mysterious. But I think what it tells us is, and also when he gets to the tomb, which I had forgotten to talk about, he weeps, which is very human. And it's something that people love to kind of focus on, that Jesus is not only physically human, like he's not like a ghost, but he has emotions. So it shows us so much. It shows us in just this story, it's only like 40 lines. He had friends, which we forget about. Jesus had not just disciples, right, and people who followed him, but friends. And they're not described as his disciples. They're his friends, right? He had friends who were honest with him. Just think about what this little story tells us, like Martha and Mary. He had friends whose death he wept over. Isn't that amazing? We tend to think of God as, Jesus as exalted, and he is. He's the Son of God. He also had friends. So it says a lot. Just that little story says so much about. And then he also invites the crowd to participate. It's like it's not just with me and Martha and Mary and Lazarus. It's all of us. So that's one of the reasons the story is so powerful for me. But that's a great question. Maybe, let's see how we're doing. Maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Only easy ones, please. Just kidding. And I'm really grateful for you guys. By the way, thank you for everyone who's standing and sitting. And I know it's uncomfortable. Thank you. I appreciate it. Hope it's not too uncomfortable. Yes.
I think about this every Triduum. Jesus died on Good Friday in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. We were told in the Creed he rose again on the 3rd day.
Yeah.
But by Sunday morning, he was already resurrected.
Yeah.
And that's always been a bit confusing.
I know.
Should we extend Holy Week for another day?
It kind of drives me nuts. I know. When I'm Pope, I'm going to change all that stuff, which means it will never happen. So then people are going to talk to me like this. It's weird. So raise your, well, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands again. So a lot of us here are going to go to what's called the Easter Triduum, which is Holy Thursday, which is very beautiful, Good Friday, which of course is about the Passion, and then the Easter Vigil. So where I go to Mass at St. Ignatius in New York, the Good Friday service is at 7 and ends at about 8:30 on Good Friday. Right, so that's the evening service. The next day is Holy Saturday, and in the evening at around 8 or 10, the Easter Vigil starts. So you got that? So 8 p.m. on Friday, 10 p.m. on Saturday, and they say, he's been in the tomb 3 days. And I'm like, no, that's ridiculous. Like, I was just here yesterday, So it really drives me a little crazy. Now, I've asked liturgy scholars, and they basically say this. Look, he dies on Good Friday. There's a night. Okay, that's 1 day. There's Holy Saturday, and then there's dawn. That's 3 days. I still don't buy it. But that's the liturgical answer. It's 3 kind of liturgical days. It still doesn't work for me. So, but I can't change it. Maybe one more question, then I'm happy to sign your books and chit-chat afterwards.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
You offered to answer questions we had about the Synod.
Sure.
And I want you to maybe explain why the Synod did not move on LGBTQ people.
Sure. I can definitely
And
talk
women,
about that.
but I
Sure,
want you
sorry.
to answer the first. Thank you.
Sure, thank you for your question. So the Synod, which I know you've had a couple cardinals come and talk about here at Sacred Heart, was a worldwide meeting of Catholics that took place over a couple of years that really consulted people on the parish level, and then the diocesan level, then the national level. So they described as the largest consultative gathering in history, like where they asked people from all over the world. And then we gathered for 2 sessions. That's a long answer. So in half of the bishops' conferences reports, all over the world, LGBTQ issues were mentioned. That's amazing. Not just in the West, not just in the US or Western Europe, but all over the place. Half of them in Africa, all over the place. So when we came into the synod, it was a topic, right? Now, the first year, I can say this because it was publicized, the first year it was explosive. And I can say this. We were all seated at tables, 12 and 12 and 12. There were like 35 tables all over the world. Cardinals, archbishops, bishops, whatever. And I was at a table in the second week, and I came in, and there was a guy who was sort of, I won't say who he was from one of the Eastern churches, and from the Middle East. And he was standing there, and one of the people at my table said, there's a little bit of a problem. He's refusing to sit next to you. And this guy, so was standing where Dr. Loris is standing, said, just to show you what's going on in the church in some places and why we can be grateful, of some of the movement that's happened with Pope Francis. This fella said to me, I'm not sitting with that. I'm not sitting with him. And he grabbed his synod-themed water bottle and left the hall and didn't come back for 2 weeks. So that's where things are in the church. Some people said to me, the reason that we have gay people in our country is because people from the U.S. come in and pay them to be gay. And I said to this, and it's, these are, you have to be very polite. It's an archbishop. And I said, well, Your Excellency, I'm sure you must agree that some people are born that way. I don't know about people coming to your country and paying them to be gay, but some people are born that way. No, they're not. It's unnatural. Okay, so there was this great division, and we talked about it on the floor of the synod, and there was this huge split between people who felt that we need to be more open and welcoming, like me, I feel like that, and people who think it's an abomination and it's disgusting and it's this. And one of the things I did was I tried to tell stories about LGBTQ people that I knew. One of the stories I told was a couple that I know, Carlos and Jim. And Carlos was, believe it or not, he had left his job at Lehman Brothers, formerly a great company, to be a hospital chaplain at a cancer center. So already a pretty amazing guy. At our parish, he was a Eucharistic minister, a lector, and a spiritual director. I mean, this is like a model person. He was also gay. He was married to he was together with his partner for 40 years. And when he got sick, his partner nursed him through doctor's visits, radiation, chemotherapy, surgery. Finally, he died. And when I did his funeral at St. Ignatius, the church was packed. This guy was a lovely guy. And I asked the synod, we only had a few times where you could talk to the whole group. Probably a little bit. How many people are in here? Maybe about 200 or so, a little bigger than this group. And I told that story, and I said, is this love or is this not love? That's the question that your church has to ask. And most people came up and said, thank you, or grazie. But, one person came up and said, that's a lovely story, but what they did is disgusting. So there's this sort of divide, I would say. Now, what changes that? What changes that is getting to know people. I'm sure most of you here know LGBTQ people. It's just getting to know them, right? And so the second year, when we were doing our final document, the other thing was, the word LGBTQ was just anathema to many people over there. That term, they just could not abide by it. It's an agenda, it's disgusting, it's political, it's an ideology, it's only in the West, right? So we started to talk about sexual minorities and gender and that kind of stuff, sexuality. So in the final document, it says the church needs to reach out to people who feel excluded because of marital identity, sexuality, and gender. So that's how that is moving ahead. Now, that sounds all negative, but frankly, this is the first time at a worldwide church gathering that this was ever discussed. And I think that's a big step forward. And between the first year, which was very contentious and explosive, and the second year, things were quite different. People were coming up to me. I'm not the only one that works with LGBT people, but I was kind of like the lightning rod. People were coming up to me and saying, oh, I thought about what you said last year, and, I met people in my diocese. And so I think there's movement happening, but I think, one of the things that we have to understand about the Pope, and I'm sure many of you do understand, is that he's dealing with a universal church. And it's the same with women deacons, the question of women deacons, which was sort of put forth. Pope Francis, what has Pope Francis done for gay people? He's the first person ever used the word, Pope ever to use the word gay. He's come out against criminalizing homosexuality. That's a big deal, right? Now, at Sacred Heart University, people might say, well, that's not a big deal. Like, of course, they shouldn't be criminalized. In Nairobi, right, or in Ghana, that's a big deal. So he is really taking a stance, and he's getting a lot of crap for it, right? He said that under certain circumstances, priests could bless same-sex unions. Bless you, right? And so he's really moving the ball ahead. But I think he doesn't want to do it at the cost of splitting the church. So that's where it stands. But I mean, I've had conversations with him multiple times, one-on-one, which is a great privilege. And he's always said, keep doing what you're doing. After the first meeting we had, can I tell you a funny story to end on? Because I think we need a funny story. Here's a funny story. So I'm not a cardinal or a bishop or a president of a university or anything. I'm just a priest that writes books and whatnot. So I'm not anything official, right? So when I was invited to join a Vatican office, to help out at a Vatican office, we had a meeting, what's called a plenary meeting, about this many people. And this friend of mine called up and said, first the funny story, then the touching part, then I'll stop. A friend of mine said, would you like to meet the Pope? I was like, yes, of course I'd like to meet the Pope. Does he want to meet me? And I mean, that's the more important question. Well, I'll ask. So he texted me back, he'd like to meet with you. So I said, well, okay, like now what? Like, would I email him like a pope@vatican.com? And he goes, well, when you go to this meeting, when you go to this plenary meeting, which was in this beautiful hall, about this many people, everyone's going to go up and have a chance to meet with him. And you introduce yourself. And I was just like, this is never going to work. Like, this is just never going to work. So, and he only really speaks Spanish and Italian. My Spanish stinks. And my Italian is not that great. So he's up there sitting in this chair, and I have this little speech, and I go up to him. So, and it's very exciting. And I have a picture of this. If you go on my Twitter account, that's the picture of us meeting. If you go on Twitter, it's us literally at that moment. And I said, Santo Padre, me llamo Jaime Martin. And he says in Spanish, which I can't remember, oh, mucho gusto, quiero una audiencia con usted. I want an audience with you. And I said, yo también, me too. And so then I'm just standing there, and he goes, talk to that guy over here, like where Dr. Loris is, talk to him. So I go over to this guy, and this guy literally, I couldn't believe this, takes out a piece of paper and says, what's your phone number? And I was like, wow, this is like really efficient. And I thought, thank God I know a little Italian. I was like, sei, quattro, sei. I'm really thinking, oh, I really want to get this right, Sei, quattro, sei. And I'm looking at it, 483, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, okay. And I thought, well, what is that? So I go back and I talk to a friend of mine who works at the Vatican, and I said, now what? And he goes, and they're very they will see him all the time, so they're very chill. And he goes, Father James, don't worry. They all call you Father James, never Jim. Father James, don't worry. The Pope knows you're here. He said he wants to meet with you. He will meet with you. And I was like, well, how's he going to get in touch with me? When your phone rings and it says restricted, I would answer it. And I said, well, all right, so I'm at this meeting, and of course, what am I doing the whole time? What am I doing the whole time? I'm looking at my phone, I'm checking my phone, I'm checking my phone. So then I go home. Here's the funny part. Then I go home to the Jesuit headquarters where I'm staying, one of the most exciting days of my life, and there's a formal invitation. They said, this came for you. I was very exciting. I get moved just thinking of it. And it's an official invitation. It's on this stationery, and it says in Italian, from the papal household, the Holy Father, Francis, requests your presence at an audience. I still remember, it's September 30th at 11 o'clock. So here's the funny line. So I go back to this meeting, and I'm so excited. And they see him all the time. And I was like, I said, wow, look what I got. And they're like, oh, bravo, Father James, bravo, complimenti, auguri, bravo for you, that's wonderful. And I said, but there's nowhere for me to respond and say I'm coming. And they were like, Father James, it's not RSVP. Like, they assume you have nothing better to do at 11 o'clock. So I was like, oh, how's 11:30? So I go in and I see him, and I had asked somebody, like, this is a big deal for me. I'd never met a pope like this before. And I said to someone, what am I supposed to do? And which was brilliant. He said, well, he invited you. You ask him what he'd like to talk about. So I go in, very exciting. You know, you go through all these different rooms and throne rooms and stuff. And he has throne rooms. And I go into his office, and it's just me and him and a translator. And I was like, you know, Holy Father, thank grazie. My Italian sucks. And fortunately, the guy was translating. And he sits down. This is before he got sick, so he's very laughing. And I said, what do you want to talk about? And he goes, what do you want to talk about? And I said, well, I'd like to talk about LGBTQ ministry. Then we'll talk about LGBTQ ministry. He knew all the things he had said. I said this, I said that, I said that, totally with it, right? Anyway, halfway through, it's only like a half an hour, like maybe 11:20. By the way, I got there at like 9 a.m. I did. They're like, Father James, you're very early. I felt like such a moron, but whatever. I'm not going to be late. So I said, halfway through, I said, well, gosh, I've been talking about LGBT stuff the whole time, like kind of dominating the conversation. Maybe he wants to ask something. Maybe he wants to talk about something else. I don't know. Maybe he wants to talk about the church in the U.S. or Jesuits or whatever, or the government. I don't know. So I said, Holy Father, through the translator, what can I do for you? Meaning, he said, you can continue your ministry in peace, con paz. So that was very moving for me. So look, he's done a lot, and he gets a lot of, you know what, for that. He gets a lot of pushback. So whereas in Fairfield, it might seem kind of tepid, in other places it's white hot. So I think we can be grateful for who he is. Anyway, listen, I just want to say thank you for coming. Keep me in your prayers. I'm happy to meet. I'm going to wear a mask because of my mom, but I'm happy to meet with you afterwards. Much.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Hope that was fun.
Oh, my
That was fun.
God.
What a nice crowd.
There should be some books out there.
Thank you for coming. Of course. Oh, okay.